Hi folks, welcome to another episode of My Life with Robert Burns. Jim Thompson and Douglas Mackenzie here again to talk to another of our cronies from around the Burns world. Hi Jim, how you doing?
Hi Douglas, doing great. As everybody else here, I've been fighting with a shed, so I'm showing my war wounds to the world.
There you go. Now, I'm not sure if all of our viewers around the world will know what a shed is, Jim.
It's a wee hut in your garden or a wee house in your garden, call it whatever you like. But the bottom line to it is I was trying to batter one and it battered me back.
Well, folks, Jim survived the turmoil of dealing with a shed. We're going to have a conversation with our guest tonight, who's the development manager for the Robert Burns Elsland Trust. And tonight, cronies everywhere, please welcome Joan McAlpine.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me here. It's an absolute delight, and doesn't take much persuasion to make me want to talk about Robert Burns, so it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Well, Joan, we don't always start off with talking about Burns. If you've seen any of these podcasts, we ask the same question to start off every episode. And that question simply is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Okay. Well, let's start from the beginning. I was born and brought up in the town of Gourock on the Clyde coast. My dad was Jim, my mum is Esther. My father worked in the shipyards on the Clyde. For most of his life, he was at sea for part of his life, and then he worked for IBM. And my mother looked after me and my two sisters, and also worked in a variety of jobs, included sewing, taking in sewing. She's a great seamstress. So I was brought up in a Scottish special council house, and I left Gourock when I was a teenager. I went to work in London, and I worked in London for a few years in various jobs as a waitress and a clerk. And then I decided I wanted to come back to Scotland. I did that when I was 19, so I went to London when I was 16. I came back to the University of Glasgow when I was 19 and studied economic history and Scottish history. And I graduated from Glasgow University in the mid-1980s and went to do a course in journalism back in London before returning to Scotland.
And you talked about school there, but you just briefly covered your school time. Was that in Gourock as well?
Yeah, well, it was Greenock. It was St Columba's Comprehensive in Green. Well, it's Greenock. It was a big school. In fact, it was one of the biggest schools in Scotland at one point. Built in the 1970s. It was quite an education there.
And was there anything?
Well, not just in all sorts of things.
Was there anything in that education that led you to believe that you're going to be doing economics and history?
I was always interested in history. I think that was probably more to do with my dad. He was very passionate about history. When he was 16, he got on his bike and cycled he was working as a boy labourer in the shipyards then, and he got on his bike and he cycled up to Glencoe. He was really interested in the Jacobites as Burns was, and he kept a diary, and he also had this book which I inherited called A Book of Scotland. We didn't have a lot of books in the house because we were great users of the library, but this was a book that he bought, and it's full of it's got Burns poems in it, but it's got, snatches of verse and prose about different aspects of Scotland, randomly. We tended to holiday in Scotland, and we would go to historic places, particularly up the east coast, exploring castles, and I was a great user of the library. So I think the first book that really got me into Scotland and Scottish history was Tales of a Grandfather by Walter Scott. Very romantic, but I was really passionate about Scottish history in particular. I liked all history, but I was really passionate about Scottish history. And so that's why, but as I got older, I was really interested in how the world worked. And that's what attracted me to economic history. So it wasn't just about, like great men. It was about the forces, the social and economic forces that kind of shape you. And I studied the industrial history of the west of Scotland because I was really interested in, you know, the industrial revolution in the west of Scotland, then the decline of heavy industry in the west of Scotland, also how people lived in industrial communities. So I was always very passionate about that.
So did you say there was a gap between leaving school and going back to university?
Yeah, I was just, I was a bit of a rebellious teenager, I have to admit. You know, I'm very, not like that now, but I was a bit of a rebellious teenager, wanted to go out and see the world. And actually, I used the money that I saved up in London when I was working in London as a teenager to travel around the Middle East when I was 18. So just brings me out in a cold sweat now, but I did. I wouldn't want my own daughters to be doing that. But yeah, I went to Egypt and Israel and Cyprus, and I saw the pyramids, and I saw the Karnak Temple and Abu Simbel and all these amazing places. It was just an incredible experience. So, you know, like backpacking. I went to Morocco later as well. I had a real wanderlust. So, but then I decided that, you know, I'd seen these amazing places, but I was really interested in coming home to Scotland.
So what was the most exciting place you went to see?
I think probably Jerusalem. I think if you've been brought up in a, you know, like, I'm not particularly religious now, but if you've been brought up religious, as I was brought up Roman Catholic, you know, like, it was so much part of your life, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're Roman Catholic, but anybody who's been brought up in a religious way, you know, with stories from the Bible, and to be in Jerusalem, and the old part of Jerusalem doesn't seem to have changed very much since 2,000 years ago. And it was just incredible. It's like stepping back in time. And so I think that was probably, as a young person, just most extraordinary experience. And the other place that's amazing is the town of Fez in Morocco. Because again, I don't know what it's like now, but at that time, it was just incredible, just stepping back in time into the souk with people dyeing materials, selling hide, selling pottery, you know, craftsmen working in front of you. It was incredible.
So you came back and you went to university. And so what did you do after university?
After university, as I say, I went to London to get a postgraduate qualification in newspaper journalism, and I freelanced for a wee while. My first job was in the Carluke and Lanark Gazette. I got an opportunity to work when over the holidays when they had people off. So that was a really interesting experience, going around all the wee, you know, communities of South Lanarkshire, you know, because it had lots of editions. That went right down to Wanlock Head, actually, and over to Colburn, and then, you know, your Biggers and all the places in the Clyde Valley. That was really, really interesting. I'm not a part of Scotland I knew. So that was a summer that I spent there. I was also freelancing for the Scotsman. Mm-hmm. I was also freelancing for the New Musical Express, writing occasional media. There was a guy called Stuart Cosgrove, who may be known to you, who was the media editor of the New Musical Express at the time, and he commissioned me to review TV programmes. So I would go down to Channel 4 and pick up big cassettes. You know, like, there was the advanced copies of the TV programmes, and you would play the cassettes, the video cassettes, and then review them. And I did sort of review gigs and records and things like that as well. And I was freelancing for the Scotsman. I wrote music reviews. For a while, I was a music reviewer for the Scotsman. I wrote under a different name. I wrote under the name Joan McCourt for reasons, because I also had a day job at that point. But I did lots of things, you know, like occasional freelance pieces for the Scotsman. But I was working for the Greenock Telegraph at the time. My first real proper job was with the Greenock Telegraph, which is a daily evening paper. And it was an opportunity to come home, and it was really good pay for, you know, like for at that time for somebody starting out in their career, because very well unionised by the NUJ. So thank you, NUJ. So the first job for me, anyway, it was very well paid. I was also doing this freelance stuff for the Scotsman, and after 2 years with the Greenock Telegraph, I got a job in the Glasgow newsroom with the Scotsman, because I also worked a few freelance shifts then, because you know, like, if they needed somebody, if they're short staffed, you could work a shift. So I worked in the Scotsman newsroom for a few years, but I was a bit of a workaholic. I was really keen to get on. I wanted to be a writer. So as well as doing the Newsbeat, I wrote features and I wanted to be a columnist. So after about 2 or 3 years, I did get my feature writing job with the Scotsman, and I did that for a few years. I had a very brief stint where I went to the Daily Record as a feature writer. I have to confess that, you know, at the time my motivation was I wanted to reach more people, but I also wanted more money. I'm sounding really materialistic here, but you know, I had a young family, so I went to the Record for that reason. Although my short period with the Record at that time, there were ups and downs with it. I think it took a wee bit of adjusting to get used to tabloid journalism after being at the Scotsman, which back in those days was quite old school. But I did some really interesting things in the short time I was with the Record. Like this, it was during the Bosnian War, so they sent me out to Bosnia with trucks from a Scottish charity. Well, what was happening in Ukraine today, actually.
Yeah.
It was the very beginning of the peace process in Northern Ireland, so I went over there and I went into some of the jails and interviewed, you know, paramilitaries in the jails and things like that. It was the very beginning of land reform in Scotland, so I did a big piece on the Ascent Crofters. So I was actually able to do some really interesting work there. But after that, I went to the Sunday Times, and I really enjoyed my time in the Sunday Times. They were launching a feature section called the Coss, and I wrote big long features for them as well as a column. And then I made a decision, I think it was after my second daughter was born, that I wanted to kind of maybe have just more strings to my bow. So I started then going into editing, and I eventually became the editor of the Sunday Times in Scotland. But an opportunity came up to become deputy editor of the Herald. So I moved to the Herald as deputy editor in 2001, just at the time of the 9/11. About 2 weeks after I started was 9/11. So that was a really interesting time because Mark Douglas Hume, who was editing the newspaper, was really ambitious for the paper, and we really wanted to, you know, like get to have a Scottish international perspective. And so my job was to commission a lot of writers, you know, to, you know, in terms of our analysis coverage, or op-ed pages, and also supervise the news operation. I wasn't the news editor, I was more like the executive sort of. But I edited the paper about 3 days a week, because newspaper editors quite often have to go away to go to business meetings with marketing and circulation. So Mark, my editor, had to do that. So I edited the paper a lot. It was just incredible, long hours and all that. And then, as there's always a big churn in newspapers, you know, when your editor goes, you're the deputy you go to. So I was then at the Sunday Times, and then they cut back. And but yeah, I had a really enjoyable career in journalism. But in 2009, after 2007, when the SNP government was elected, I always wrote about politics, you know, like I was a political, you know, columnist. But obviously after 2007, when the SNP government was elected, there was a completely different feel to politics. And then an opportunity came up to get involved in politics, and I was elected in the MSP in 2011. And I did that for 10 years. I won't go into all that because this is non-political, but that was an interesting time. So I did that for 10 years, and then stopped being an MSP last year. But for 2 years before that, I had for the beginning of lockdown, actually, it was when I became chair of the Robert Burns Elsland Trust. And during lockdown, that took up a lot of my spare time, most of my spare time, actually. So after I stopped being an MSP, I was really keen to continue to progress the trust, which we can talk more about later. But that's where I am. That's a kind of like you told me ahead of this that I should pause, and I'm aware I haven't paused. I've just basically been photomouthed, so you might want to, I don't know if you want to double back.
Well, what I'd quite like to double back to is the editing of a a newspaper? Because I've never fully understood what an editor needs to do.
Right. Oh gosh. Well, an editor makes a lot of decisions about the paper, you know, like, so basically you have 2 conferences a day plus a picture conference. So the first thing, but what you have to do is you're making decisions, so you have to be well informed. So you get up really early and make sure you listen to the news, and then you read the newspapers, and you read PA copy, that's Press Association, so you know what's going on. And then your first conference is about 10, 11. And so all your heads of department, your sports editor, your news editor come into the conference, and they have a list and they tell you what they're working on, and you sort of say what you're interested in and how you'd like to see it developed. So you might have ideas, or, you know, they might say, you know, there's this, you know, the shipyard's closing down, and you say, well, make sure that you have, you know, interviews with, you know, the wives or whatever, you know, so you can kind of suggest things, develop ideas, suggest writers for it. You also kind of like say what you think is a good story or not. You might say, it might come up with a story and say, oh, I read that in the Record last week. That's not a news story, you know, like, not that happen very often at the Herald, of course. But yeah, so you have 2 of those. And then basically what you're doing is you're giving them a steer as to what to develop with their writers. And then in the afternoon, they've come back with those developed stories. Some stories don't work out, they don't stand up. And then there'll be new breaking stories. So, you know, like, so a breaking story during the day, you know, you then as an editor, the news editor might come to you and say, you know, a plane's flown into the World Trade Center, and you have to decide what you're going to do, who you're going to allocate to that story. And that's, again, you know, like, then after the evening conference, you have a picture conference. So that you then select the pictures that you want to go with the stories. And after that, it's very much you're reading stuff. So I edited quite a lot of stuff as well. So because I was kind of, part of mine, you know, was the op-ed page. So I really like editing, you know, like, I like editing good writers, because if you've got a good writer, you can slightly improve them if they've got something to say. And you can write headlines. You work with what you call your backbench. That's the subs that produce the paper, and you can position stories in the pages. You decide which stories you're going to give big treatments to, and which stories they're going to go down the page. So, and in between times, you're developing ideas with writers. You're managing writers. I wrote a column as well when I was at the Herald. So you're doing that too. You can develop.
So it's almost all encompassing.
Yeah, develop new sections as well. Like, while I was at the Herald, I worked with writers to develop new sections. So a weekend feature section. So you decide what you're going to have in the weekend feature section. A news review style section. I developed that, and I developed a section on society. Which was a magazine, which was basically about health and social care. And I developed some one-off things, like I developed one on teenagers. So that's like when you see these adverts, you know, by the Herald this week, and you'll get this free part work on teenagers, or on, you know, like patient power was another one that we developed. So I kind of like worked on those one-off things.
Wow. Quite a wide range of stuff. With all that going on, how much time did you have for other kind of leisure activities?
Well, I had 2 children, so all my time was my leisure. My personal time was spent with my children. I can't pretend I wasn't climbing mountains or, you know, like doing anything like that. I had work and I had my family, because you can't really do anything. If you've got a big demanding job and you've got children, you have to spend all your free time with your children. So it was like, you know, I got a lot of help from grandparents, but, you know, like taking them to ballet lessons, taking them to music lessons, taking them to French lessons, taking them to theatre, ice skating, all that kind of stuff. That was how I spent my free time. And
you mentioned family a few times. Do you want to give them a shout out?
Yes, my eldest daughter, Grace, is a design engineer. She lives in Warwick. And my youngest daughter, Eleanor, is an actor, musician. And she's currently performing in an Old Vic play called A Monster Calls, which was actually supposed to be opening tonight down in London, but one of the cast got COVID, so I've yet to get an update on that as to where they are with that. Yeah, I'm very proud of them both. And their dad is Pat Kane, the former musician. I should give their name's Kane. So that's my ex-husband was Pat Kane, the lead singer of Hue and Cry, and he's the father of my children. And I get on very well with him.
Oh, good. That's nice to hear. So you mentioned travelling as a teenager before university. What about recent travel? Do you do much?
Well, lockdown hasn't allowed us to do much travelling, has it? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like, I find again, my free time is spent traveling to see my kids. So I had a lovely time last weekend because it was a special birthday. I'm not going to say which special birthday it was, but it was my special birthday, and I went down to London to see both my kids because it's difficult because Eleanor's in a play. She can't get up. She doesn't have much time off. And Grace is in Warwick, so she's not that far from London. So we went to London and did nice things. I actually find London much nicer than when I worked there. It's quite a nice place to go for a couple of days. During lockdown, when they lifted the restrictions, the place that I go every year, should have said this with my family, is Arran. I go to Arran every year. When I was a wee girl, we went and stayed in a farmhouse in Lamlash. And for the past since my dad died in 2015, we all go as an extended family. So I've got two sisters. I've got another sister called Maureen McAlpine. She's got a young son. And her husband is Jerry. So they come. My mum Esther, my aunt Eleanor, who's widowed, my two daughters, me and my partner Stuart Patterson. So we all go, and we've got several houses now. We take over Lamlash and we go there every year. We just missed it in the first lockdown. We go every year and we absolutely love it.
Well, I can match that because I go to Lamlash every year as well.
Oh, do you? Oh, very good. Where do you stay?
Well, we stay in, goodness sake. Oh, I want to get prompted from my wife here. We stay in Oak Bank Farm up the hill.
Oh yeah,
and we've been going there for a number of years, and it's excellent. And we're in the lodge at the top of the hill where there's nothing between us and Holy Isle, so we love that.
It's just lovely. Those views out to Holy Isle. We stay at Woodside, which is down just on the left. As you come into Lamlash, turn left. It's lovely, and it's just lovely.
Yeah, I know where you are. No, we've been doing that since our eldest son was 6 weeks old, and he's now, a bit older, and has just made his grandparents. And we'll be editing this podcast, so he might take that bit out.
We also take. It's also a holiday. In fact, I should have said this. I've got a sister who has Down syndrome. And she doesn't like flying or traveling abroad or anything, but she, Laura, her name is, and she comes on her holiday as well to Arran, and she absolutely loves it, and it's just a lovely opportunity to catch up, and it's a really nice time.
Fantastic place. Could talk about Arran all night, but anyway, let's move on. I'm going to ask Jim to talk to you in a bit more detail now about how you made that transition from being a journalist and then politician to being involved with Elsland and the rest of your interest in Robert Burns. So I'll pass over to Jim.
Well, the first question is to everybody, how did you bump into Robert Burns in your life?
How did I bump into Robert Burns? Yeah, I thought you'd probably ask this question, and it really got me thinking, I think in Scotland, you bump into Robert Burns without realising it. So when I was young, I think it was like this book I told you about, The Little Book of Scotland, Scots Wha Hae. I don't think I loved Scots Wha Hae, but I don't think it even registered that it was Burns, And similarly, I think the songs as well. I was teaching myself to play the piano as a wee girl, so I learned Scots Wha Hae, and Your Banks and Braes is in this book as well, and My Heart's in the Highlands is in this book. And when I was teaching myself the piano, in one of these Scottish holidays, actually, I think just having these beautiful songs that were written about Scotland and the people in it, they really spoke to me. But I didn't know much about Burns. I just loved the songs. And then I guess, yeah, obviously you get a little bit of Burns in school, but in my school you got very, very little Burns. And then when I was a student, we had started doing kind of Burns suppers in the flat. I never went to a formal Burns supper, but in the big mixed flat that we had in the West End of Glasgow, we would have a fun, you know, casual Burns supper. And the actor, we had an actor who was sharing the flat with us, and he did Tam O'Shanter. And I had never heard anything like it in my life. You know, I was just like, because obviously did it really well. A bit like Bobby Jess does it, you know, well, maybe not quite as good as Bobby Jess, but when somebody's really good at doing something, you know, like it just brought it to life. And so again, you know, there was that kind of like always in the background love of Burns, but I think I really, really got into him probably when I had my first child. And see, 1990, there was a play commissioned for the City of Culture from Liz Lockhead called All Jock Tamson's Bairns. And it wasn't the most complimentary play about Robert Burns, actually. It was Robert Burns from a feminist perspective and Jean Armour moaning about never been home and all that. But Rod Patterson was singing in it. And it just introduced me to a whole different group of Burns songs, like Green Grow Their Ashes Oh, and things like that. And that's when I started really, really getting into Burns and reading about him. And I just think it develops more and more. And I think the other change was possibly moving to Dumfries and Galloway as well, and seeing the expertise and the love that people have, like for Burns here. It's not, you know, like when you look at the pictures of his funeral in Dumfries and the people that turned out for it, that's kind of still there in Dumfries and Galloway. And, you know, going to Burns suppers where, you know, people from all walks of life were experts in Burns. You know, Bobby Jess is a good example of that. But they really devote a lot of their own time to Burns for the love of it. And I kind of, one of the first things I did was get involved in the big Burns supper. You know, like Burns is a custodian of Scottish culture. And I've always really been passionate about preserving Scottish culture. And that's what Burns was trying to do in the 18th century. And so I kind of got involved in supporting that festival and making sure that they got money and support from the government and everything. But yeah, that's, but I think probably, you know, in recent years, I've kind of learned more and more about them, and I've appreciated. Oh, one other thing I need to say, actually, another turning point was when I was at the Sunday Times. In the late, about 2008, 2009, Robert Crawford's book, The Bard, came out, and the Sunday Times Scotland brought the serialisation rights to the book out. And so one of my jobs as an editor, this is another thing that editors do, is that they would, if you serialise a book, you know, like you have to then edit it, because you can't write the whole book, you can't reprint the whole book in the newspaper. So obviously read the book and then, you know, like extracted the bits that I thought were best. But that gave me a whole new insight into Burns and into Scotland at the time of Burns. It's an absolutely brilliant book. I tell everybody who's wanting to learn more about Burns that they must read that book, The Bard. It's just a fantastic book. It just shows him in a completely different light. But yeah, I think, and I'm just learning more and more about him all the time. Going to Elsland for the first time, I learned so much about him. And at Elsland, I'm just always learning about him. I just feel so passionate about how important he was. And I don't think people quite understand. A lot of people don't understand how important he was for our country and our culture.
Certainly was, as far as music's concerned. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, and if you're into songs, you'll understand that. But yeah. I'm curious, because you mentioned Burns suppers, and I'm thinking, as a politician in MSP, you must have been invited to speak at them.
Oh yeah. But probably before that, I hadn't been. You know, like I had been, well, maybe just before, yeah, before I was a politician. When I had been to a few, but not that many. It was all quite casual. I mean, I used to live in a big tenement block in Partick, and we used to have a burn supper. It was great big rooms in these big houses, and we used to have a big burn supper with the neighbours. And again, we had somebody really good doing tam o'shanter. So we did it in that casual way. But those formal burn suppers, I only started speaking at them after I became an MSP. I mean, it sounds a bit funny, but I wasn't really a public speaker before I became an MSP. I'm probably still not a public speaker, really, some would say. But I have given a few immortal memories since being elected, and a few addresses from the lassies, which have sometimes gone down well.
I was just thinking of my own Burns life. I don't know, I couldn't count the number of burn suppers I've been to where there's been a member of the Scottish Parliament present. But you mentioned songs, and I need to ask, what would be your favourite, or some of your favourites?
Oh gosh, my favourite. I think, you know, Your Banks and Braes has got a special place for that because it's the first one I heard, I think, when I was really young. And there's a really nice story. I don't know if you've ever heard it, and maybe I should tell this story. I might get accused of things, but I think it was when I heard it as a child, where Napoleon was imprisoned in St Helens Island, and he was imprisoned in this. I think he was in a house, wasn't it? A kind of colonial house, and he heard the daughter of the house playing a song on the piano, and he said, "That's the only pretty English song I've ever heard." And somebody said it's not an English song, but I don't know if that's true or apocryphal, but I mean, I'm very, very fond of that song for that reason. There's another song that I heard after I came to Dumfries and Galloway. No, my daughter sang it. My daughter's a professional singer, and her school used to have a Scots language competition, a Scots singing competition, and she learned Caw the Yows. And I have to confess, I hadn't heard it before. And she's, you know, I was like, wow, that's amazing. And then I heard a guy, a local guy you might know, called John Caskey from Dumfries, who's a great singer. And he sang it at the unveiling of the monument outside St Michael's Kirk. He's a great singer. I love that song. That's beautiful. But obviously Auld Lang Syne was written at Elsland. And the more, you know, like, again, it's one of these things that's in the background of your life, isn't it? But now, because, you know, like, I'm working at Elsland, and a big thing that we're trying to push is that this is the most famous song in the world, and it was written here at Elsland. People are singing it in Times Square. They sang it at the close of the Winter Olympics. Apparently, department stores play it when they close their doors every day in Japan. You know, like, it's something. And I suppose you sing it at family weddings, and you sing it when you're with your family and you're thinking about people that you've lost. And so that's really, really special. I could go on and on. It's very difficult to choose, isn't it?
Well, I saw Jim Thompson sitting up when you mentioned Caw the Yows, because I know it's his favourite song. And I'm sure he's going to engage in a conversation about the Caw the Yows.
Well, there's two versions of Caw the Yows, and I would say to you that I am in love with the first version of Caw the Yows. I think it's for me, it's the most endearing song that Burns wrote about love through a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So the last verse, which I'll not say again because everybody who knows me hears me saying it all the time. But the bottom line to it is it's such a wonderful example of for me, Burns. And I appreciate that folk like the song about the rose and all that other stuff. But I just love that, and I always have, and it's my favourite song. However, enough of that rant. You've not mentioned poetry apart from Tam O'Shanter. If we just missed Tam O'Shanter out, just for me, and is there anything else that you like in terms of his poems?
Oh yeah, oh gosh, you know, Tam O'Shanter is just, I mean, I will say a little bit more, but again, obviously, you know, like, there are actors and people like Bobby Jess who can. There's another guy in from Dumfries and Galloway who's sadly died now, called Scott Rorison, who did an amazing tam o'shanter as well. He passed away a couple of years ago. He was from Annan. But, you know, like, I set myself trying to learn it a few years ago. I never succeeded, but I remember taking my youngest daughter, the one who became an actor, to the old display of tam o'shanter before at Alloway, before it was all revamped. And
yeah, remember it.
She talked about it. She was obsessed with it. She was a wee thing. She was about 4, and I had to act it out for her. You know, like, she just was absolutely obsessed. It's just incredible, such a masterpiece. But yeah, no, he wrote many fine poems. I mean, Tea Moose, I think, is a really important poem, and because people think it's a children's poem, and obviously it appeals to children, but it's an enlightenment poem. It's a really, really profound poem about, you know, the state of the working man, and how, you know, like, the human condition, and how, you know, as a human being, you know, you think about the past, and, you know, all the terrible things that probably happened to you, and things that happened to him, and you're wondering what the hell the future holds, when you're wondering how to, you know, feed your kids and stuff like that. But the mouse doesn't have to worry about that. And it's just an incredibly profound piece of work. So the other poem I really like is the one that he wrote towards the end of his life, O What Art Thou in the Cold Blast. And I think that's probably, after Tam O'Shanter, my favourite poem, because Tam O'Shanter is a masterpiece. You can't get away from Tam O'Shanter. But Cold Blast is, I think I first came across Cold Blast actually at that play I mentioned, All Jack Tamson's Bairns, because there was a group of musicians called the Cold Blast Orchestra, and it was a piece of promenade theatre. And you started out in one part of the tramway, it was, and you followed the Cold Blast Orchestra playing this music into the theatre. But he wrote it for the girl who was nursing him when he was dying. And I just think it's just the most profound poem. And it's not just about love, because he obviously wasn't in love with this girl. He was, you know, I think she was just a young girl that was looking after him. But in terms of friendship and connection, and, you know, just saying, I'll look after you. Oh, I'm getting all emotional, actually. I'll look after you, whatever. You know, as a mother and all that, I used to think about it a lot, you know, towards my children, the kind of strength of feeling in that poem. And he also probably was in the Cold Blast a lot, you know. He knew exactly what it was, but he was talking about it in a metaphorical sense as well. So yeah, that's really, really important to me too.
Wonderful. Written for Jessie Lures, just deathbed as well. And I always use it when I'm doing a toast to the lasses, because men recognise that desire to wrap your arms around someone young and vulnerable and protect them from the ills of life, as Burns did in that song or poem.
Yeah.
Wonderful stuff. Now, we mentioned Elsland, and I think it would be great if you could tell folk what's happening there, and what the changes are, and what we're doing going forward.
Sure. Well, Elsland, I mean, obviously your audience is probably very knowledgeable about Burns and his life, but even so, Elsland in the past has kind of been overlooked, because he was there for 3 years, and maybe you know, it has kind of been overlooked. However, he wrote a quarter of his songs and poems at Elsland. He built the farm himself. He designed and built the farm himself. And it's just outside Dumfries, 6 miles outside Dumfries. I think one of the things that's really important about Elsland, after the creativity there, the kind of the work they produced, Auld Lang Syne and Tam O'Shanter, is that Burns was the first, like Robert Crawford said, he was the first celebrity. He was a celebrity. He was like a rock star in Edinburgh after the success of his book, Poems Chiefly in the Scots Dialect. And he could have stayed in Edinburgh and lapped that up, but he wanted to get back to his roots. And that's what Elsland represented. It was him. I want to go back to farming. I don't want to have the life of a farmer that I had in Ayrshire, which was absolutely appalling and really, really, really hard. But he thought, I do want to get back amongst my own people. I want to get back to what I am, the sense of identity as a farmer. And also, You know, people talk about how he was bad to Jean, and you know, as a feminist, you know, you have to say, you know, he wasn't the best in terms of his sexual politics, but you know, he was caring, and she had lost 3 children by then, I think, 3 babies, and I think that, you know, he didn't talk about that a lot, but that was obviously playing on his mind. It was an opportunity to do the right thing to her, by her. But yeah, just that, you know, I think it says a lot about him, that that's what he wanted to do. And it was full of optimism. He was still a young man. He was only, well, he was late 20s, and she was even younger. So the place is full of romance and optimism and this idea of going back to your roots. It's just a very special place for that reason. Now, it was put into trust in 1923, which was a fantastic thing, because it meant that it wasn't interfered with. And people, it was still a farm, a working farm, but the farm tenant had to allow people in to see Burns's room. And the trust that ran it at that time, the Elsland Trust, started a collection of Burns manuscripts and items associated with Burns. So we have some wonderful things in our collection, like his flute, like his fishing rod. He fished for trout in the Nith and so on. And the connection with the lending library that he started for local agricultural workers, because he wanted to expose other working class people to the kind of opportunities that he had to read. So him and his friend Robert Riddle started this library, and the remnants of it are at Elsland, but we need to do a bit of research work on that. So that's a little bit of background about the place. What had happened is that the way the old trust was set up, it had run out of money, because its original business model was just, they'd have a farmer, they would open up the farm to people who were coming to see Burns, and that was fine. And then they had a live-in curator who was paid a stipend in lieu of rent, and that worked business-wise, but you can't do that anymore. You know, like, people aren't employed for rent anymore. So the old trust then started employing a curator, or not a curator, but somebody to manage the place and live in. And they also started to look at the future and commission some consultants and so on. And as a result of that, you know, they were facing a real financial crisis. And because they were set up in 1923, all the governance of that meant they couldn't really raise funds in the way that modern charities can raise funds. So they said, we need to divest ourselves of this, because the other thing is the trustees of the old trust were there because of the job they did. So the town clerk of Dumfries or the sheriff of Dumfries inherited the role of managing the farm, where they didn't ask for it. So a new trust was set up, and the board was people who were genuinely interested in the place. And I had been interested in the place as an MSP, but at that time I had had a number of debates in the Scottish Parliament that I had done on the instigation of Professor Murray Pittock about Robert Burns and the Scottish economy and the potential of heritage assets. And I always felt that Elsland was the most incredible heritage asset that was underused. So when they asked me to come onto the board of this new trust, I said that I would do that. I jumped at the chance. And had the opportunity to work with some amazing people who are fellow trustees, like Dr. David Hopes, who was the former director of the Robert Burns the Birthplace Museum, and Professor Jerry Crothers from the Centre of Robert Burns Studies. So we took over in 2020. We realised that we were facing a financial crisis, so we had to restructure. Cut our costs, so we took the land management in-house instead of using a land manager, because we've still got 170 acres, and we had a property as well that we rented. We obviously didn't have an income from visitors during lockdown, so we started, you know, fundraising. We started having Zoom events that were, you know, like educating people about Burns, like yourselves, we've just tried to modernise the place. We're a membership charity. So what we're doing is, you know, if you become a member, you get free access to our online events, you get free access to the site, and hopefully we'll develop the membership so you get a discount on anything we produce and sell. We've got Burns Club members, and they can use our facilities for their membership. And I'm just starting to develop corporate membership as well. And our first corporate member is Annandale Distillery and the Globe Inn, which is very appropriate, Burns' favourite house in Dumfries. And well, we are, there's so much to say. I don't know if you want me to stop talking now so you can ask me another question, because I could go on and on about what our plans are. I'll take a breather just now.
No, I think the plans and what you see as the future of it is really important for the Burns audience out there.
Sure.
Because and whilst we've all read things and we've received the circulations, it's really it's of value, particularly to people like me who are just Burns Club members, to find out what's going to happen at Elsland, because it's intrinsic and part of the Burns lore and history. I mean, it's just, without Elsland, Scotland loses a lot. And for me, it's perfectly sited. Personally, I think, you know, it's close to the border, and it's in southwest Scotland where he was, and it's easy to get to.
Yeah, it's easy to get to in a sense, but you know, like for you know, you need a car to get there. So you know, we need to, you know, improve public transport links and so on. But what we want to do is, well, we had to stabilise the finances, but we still, in terms of our revenue, you know, like if we employ anybody out of our core funds, we run a deficit. So we have to raise funds to employ anyone. So, for example, I'm on a 1-year contract, and that is funds that we have raised from a fund called Adapt and Thrive, which was, it's basically Scottish Government money, but it's allocated by the SCVO, the Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations, and that's to help fundraise basically and develop new income streams. And we've got another member of staff who is Kickstart and Museums Galleries Scotland. So we have to raise money for our staff that way. But we have raised quite a lot of money for different things. So, for example, we raised money for a conservation study, and that was from Historic Environment Scotland. Because, and I have to give credit to David Hopes, the vice chair of the charity, for this. He says you can't do anything to the site until you understand the site, until you understand the history of the site. You can't start pulling it apart or adapting it, you know. And so this conservation study cost £12,000, and it's from a historic buildings expert called Will Napier, from Adams Napier in Peebles. And he spent a lot of time looking at the site and its history. And what we discovered is that Burns built more of the site than was previously supposed, and that it's likely that nothing was on that site before Burns arrived. Now, it was previously believed that a couple called the Cullies had a house, an old farm there, and that Burns modernised it. But we now think that Burns built both the barns plus the farmhouse, which we always knew he built. He laid out the fields. The fields there are exactly the same layout as he laid out. He was a modernising farmer. Had previously been in by and out by the old lowland version of Runrig. And so he introduced dairy cattle. And so there's a really interesting story there about Burns, the modernising farmer as well. But it meant that, like the previous trust had a plan to demolish one of the buildings, for example, and that would have been one of the buildings that had been built by Burns, the barn. And that's not their fault, it's just that they hadn't had the money to conduct that study. And so what we want to do is we want to develop the place in a way that keeps the historic buildings as they are, but finds new uses for them. Because it was modernised, it was developed a little bit in the 1990s, but some of the materials that were used then are trapping dampness inside the buildings. And it's not that you don't have the kind of facilities that you need to run events and things like that now. So what we would like to do is we've had a number of business studies done, and our vision for the place now is to get the repairs done that we need done, but also to do the adaptations that we need to do to the buildings so that more people come, so that we would have a cafe that people could visit. And there's a beautiful cattle court, which is just a sun trap and fantastic acoustics. So if we could adapt that courtyard for performances and outdoor things. We've got a beautiful orchard. We don't know if Burns planted it or not. It used to be thought that he had planted it. Now we're not so sure because of the conservation study. I personally would like to create a garden inspired by Burns, because in all due respect, we have a wonderful museum and a wonderful collection in the house, but people aren't going to keep coming back to see it. You need other reasons to get people to keep coming. So I would love to have a garden inspired by Burns, perhaps in the orchard, perhaps somewhere else, because people keep coming back to that. It also provides employment. It's about well-being and sustainability. The Burns house itself is amazing. We have his Spence, which he designed himself to look over the Nith for inspiration. Again, there's the dampness trapped in the walls and everything. And the layout is slightly different from the way it would have been in his time. Not too different, but in his time you would have had a ladder going up to the attic where the children and the farm workers slept, and now you've got a staircase and there's a kind of corridor. But in Burns's time you wouldn't have had a hallway as such, but the stove's still there and everything. Anyway, what we'd like to do is to take, as well as repairing the cottage, to take it back to exactly the way that it was at Burns' time. And our secretary of our board, Professor Jerry Carruthers, has made some very interesting discoveries, which I can't talk about because they'll be publicised later, but about some of the things that Burns bought when he moved into Elsland. So we want to recreate it exactly as it was, so you felt as if Burns has just left the room. That's what we want to do with the cottage. And we want it to be a centre of creative learning. So the music that Burns wrote there, it's obviously so important, but a quarter of his musical output was written there. Although he still wrote poetry after he moved to Elsland, the shift towards his musical work was very significant, and a lot of the Scottish Musical Museum volumes that he effectively edited were produced there. And you know, I know he collected a lot of the songs in his earlier travels when he was in the Highlands and everything, and was inspired by some of the bits of work that he heard. But so many of them were produced at Elsland. So our thinking is that in terms of creative learning, if we could have a centre for songwriting and music, and that people could come to, I mean, our vision is like a place you can escape to, because that's like, when we ask people about Elsland, they say it feels like it's escaping. They're stepping back in time. And we feel that people would come from all over the world to be inspired by the place, just as Burns was inspired. So that's our long-term vision. And we want to do that in such a way that preserves the setting, because previous plans have included big visitor centres and stuff like that. And if you went down that road, you'd have to be really, really careful that you didn't interfere in the setting.
Yep.
Because the setting that inspired Burns has hardly changed. And that's what our conservation study said. Will Napier, who wrote the conservation study, said, there's something that always sticks in my mind, you know, like, you know, if old Mr. Burns's father went back to the, you know, the house, the big inn in Ayrshire, he would see it much changed with a busy road and everything. And even the house in Dumfries much changed. And the farms, I know that some of the farms still exist, but they are modern farms and they'll have changed a bit. Elsland is the most authentic Burns site. It's the least changed. And the setting is hardly, the trees that are planted around Elsland were planted as part of Burns's tenancy. It's in the tenancy agreement that Dul Swinton and Patrick Miller had to plant the trees. So I'm not mean the same, they're not exactly the same trees probably, but the actual setting is all about Burns. So we have to find a way of making a sustainable visitor attraction, a centre of creative learning that doesn't interfere and spoil that wonderful setting. But also we have to create revenue streams, you know, for it. And that's like, you know, people come to you and say, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And that would be a nice thing to do. But we're not getting any regular public money. I mean, I have to apply for the grants. We get one-off grants for this and that. We don't get, it's not like Historic Environment Scotland where you get the money to maintain the property because the government own it. We're a charity and we have to wash our face. So, and that's really challenging when you're looking after an important collection, really important buildings. And you want to employ enough people, you want to employ the people to do all the, you know, to run the cafe, to look after the collection that Elsland deserves. But we're going to do that. I'm determined that we do it. And what the last piece of work I'll do as part of my contract, even if I, you know, I stop doing it in August, and I hope we'll find some money to continue the work. But the last piece of work I'm going to be doing is a feasibility study on all our ideas. So I'm raising money to get that feasibility study and engagement done and to test our ideas on the wider Burns community, the local community, the creative community. Are we going in the right direction? And this is what we'd like to do, and to get first stage architectural plans outlined for our plans for the future. That's something that will probably happen. That consultation will happen over this summer. It's not a consultation, it's an engagement exercise. And looking at how we adapt all the buildings, but preserve them as well. And then I've already got some money for that from Historic Environment Scotland. And then we start on our development. And once we've got our vision absolutely sketched out for everyone and everybody knows where we're going, we then go to the international community. And we have the big fundraising campaign. We go to the lottery and the other big fundraisers. And so there's a sequence to doing these things. So that's why I hope I can be there for a little bit longer, so I can kind of take that through, you know, like, because it's probably the earliest if we decide, you know, on capital work, the earliest it will probably 2024. But we did get money from the Architectural Heritage Fund for emergency repairs, I'm pleased to say. So I've got roofers there just now, local roofers who are repairing the roofs of the historic buildings. And one other thing that we're doing that you might be interested in, and this was something that we did decide to do rather than part of the long-term plan. The Old Trust built a bungalow inside in the 1960s to house a farm worker. And then later on, it was tenanted and it provided an income for the trust. And it was vacated during, the tenant decided to move out during the lockdown, but it probably wasn't in a fit state to re-let. So we've succeeded in getting a grant from South of Scotland Enterprise to renovate it as holiday accommodation. So it will be Burns themed holiday accommodation, and we're making it a lot more sympathetic to the historic buildings. And that work's underway just now. In fact, you've got an exclusive there because it's not actually been publicised yet. South of Scotland Enterprise, who are our funders, will be publicising it probably in the next week, actually. I know that you're going out later, but that's dead exciting because that's going to provide us with the revenue that we need to keep going until we've got this master plan in place. So I'm probably been really boring here. We went from talking about the cold blast and all anxiety, and I'm kind of, you know, talking about feasibility studies, but that's the way it's got to be. That's you know, like you take these projects forward.
Joan, I think it's probably fair to say that you've been very passionate about it, and I think that passion's important. And with our audience, all the guys out there and guys and gals out there are going to be keen to see how they can support you. Can you tell us a bit about membership and how they go about taking out membership, that kind of thing?
Well, individual membership is really easy to take out. You just go to our website, which is www.elsland farm.co.uk, and you can go to membership. So there's individual memberships, £15 a year, and as I say, for that you get free access to the farm and free access to our online events, which have been of really high quality. If I blow our own trumpet, you know, like we had Murray Pittock talking about burns in the Scottish economy. We obviously launched our conservation study. We've had Jerry Carruthers leading things, and our other trustee, Emily Smith, the singer. So we've had some really good online events. And we'll be developing the offer for members as we go forward as well. You know, if we say launch a retail product, we're hoping to give members a discount. We're also hoping to get a membership card sorted. We've got a little bit of money from Museum Galleries Scotland to do that and to set up a more professional membership system. But you can join online that way. And if you're in a Burns Club and you want to help us, we've set up our 1788 circle. Again, it's on the website. Is obviously that's the year Burns arrived at Elsland, and that's £200. And Burns clubs get all the same advantages as the other individual members, but they can also use Elsland for events. So we've got the Sandiford Burns Club from Glasgow coming in April, and they're having a Burns supper, which is their first Burns supper since before lockdown. So that's really exciting. So they're coming down to see the farm, take advantage of their membership, you know, to see the farm and have a Burns supper. So you can also donate. We've got a Just Giving page, and again, that's available through our website, and you can donate funds if you wish through the Just Giving. And we have regular fundraising events. Our online events recently haven't been fundraising events because, well, if you're not a member, you pay for them, and so they have raised funds that way. But they're kind of geared towards giving something back to members. You know, like, so, you know, you're a member and thank you, and you know, here's something that you can have back. So once. Well, I think I'd like to have a big fundraiser again this year, though. Maybe it's for St Andrew's night or something like that. That was focused on fundraising rather than membership. But what you have to be careful about is we always need money. Definitely, anybody who can. The way to help us keep going is to improve our revenue stream through members. So if there's any Burns clubs out there, or any high net worth individuals who want to give us lots of money, you know, please sign up. But, you know, we will be having, once we've got our master plan in place, our big vision document and our plans, that's when we'll go out and have a proper big structured international fundraising campaign. So I think it's important that when you're asking people for a lot of money, you tell them where it's going. You know, like, and during lockdown, people understood that every place needed money during lockdown, but we need to be able to tell people where their money's going. At the moment, you're keeping us going, you're keeping the thing alive, but you know, like, you know, in future we'll have plans, and that people can all feed into that.
Great. And from the point of view of access during this coming season, can people just walk in, or do they need to book in advance?
We are hoping to move to a system where people can walk in. We've got some issues just now in terms of staffing, actually, and it's difficult to get volunteers. If anybody wants to volunteer as a front of house or gardener at Elsland, you know, like to be a guide, that would be wonderful. Or just serve tea and coffee and take the money when people visit. We're really keen to get volunteers to do that. We had a wonderful volunteer, Joan Beck, last year, who did our guiding, who sadly became ill. And if he's watching this, thank you, Joan. Hope you're feeling better. Yeah, we really need volunteers to help us guides. But we will. I think we'll be okay. We just have a few challenges. We hope to open on the 2nd of April for people to drop in. And I'm actually hiring people I was hiring people to staff so that we can do that. But we should.
And I saw from the news today that you've been installing new picnic tables and everything.
Yeah, that was a grant from the Nithsdale Area Committee of Dumfries and Galloway Council. Gave us £1,000 for picnic tables. Thank you very much. So what we're hoping to do is, you know, like people can come with their flasks, but we hope to be able to serve teas and coffees maybe out the window of Robert Burns's bedroom, which was my office. Imagine that, my office is in Robert Burns's bedroom. And we're probably I actually was talking, there's a wonderful place in Dumfries called the Usual Place Cafe, which works with young people with autism and learning disabilities. As a cafe, it's a working cafe, but it's also a training opportunity for people. And we're talking about selling their tray bakes. So the food is prepared off site, because we're really not in a position to prepare food on site. It's just not. It wouldn't be appropriate to prepare food on site. So if food's prepared off site, we can then sell it, and then we're working with another charity that's doing really good things. So we're hoping to do that over the summer. I just have to put a few things like staffing and volunteers in place, but people should be able to roll up over the summer. But we would like you to book. I mean, you can, but we're also developing some tours as well, special tours. So we'll have a Dram and Bannock tour that's bookable, and we're going to get a special bannock made for it, and an Annandale Dram, Man of Words, which is named after Robert Burns. That's going to be aimed at the kind of travel trade market. So to bring in an income, and that'll be delivered by specialists in Burns. So someone like maybe Rose Byers, our youth ambassador, who's a wonderful traditional singer, or Stuart Patterson, the poet, who is a volunteer guide for us last year, who's also my partner in transparency. But he gave a lot of his time last year as a volunteer guide. But yeah, no, it's £5 to come. If you're not a member, it's £5 entrance, which is an absolute bargain for what you get. Yeah, you can see the collection and enjoy the river walks and everything.
Well, it's all sounding very, very exciting, and it was getting more exciting there as we were getting to the end of this episode, unfortunately. So really it just leaves us to say, Joan, thanks very much for telling us all about your life with Robert Burns. Thank you.
Thanks, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.